Hey, folks, welcome to Phantoms and Monsters Radio. Now, tonight, we step into one of the Middle East oldest and most disturbing supernatural traditions, the Ghoul. Now, in Arabic and Islamic folklore, the Ghoul was never merely a monster in the wilderness. It was a thing of graves, ruins, lonely roads, desolate mountains, and deceptive thresholds, a predatory presence that could assume a human semblance, mimic the familiar, and reveal its true nature only after the victim had already crossed too far into danger. Now, what makes the Ghoul tradition so enduring is that its core patterns still surface in modern testimony. We still hear reports of pale humanoids near cemeteries and abandoned places, of inhuman screams in remote terrain, of creatures associated with the dead, of entities that seem to lure, circle, watch, or imitate. Now, whether these accounts represent folklore carried forward, misidentified biological realities, interdimensional manifestations, or something even stranger, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. The old stories have not disappeared. They may simply be wearing new faces. Now, our first account takes us into Iraqi Kurdistan near the Iranian border, where the old word itself was spoken aloud. Local villagers and Kurdish forces did not describe an unknown animal or a fugitive soldier. They used a far older term, one that carried centuries of fear behind it: Ghoul. Now, what makes this report especially compelling is its setting and tone. The mountains, the hunted locals, the night screams from the past, and the complete lack of physical trace all fit the older pattern of a predatory presence that is sensed more often than it is clearly seen. Now, this first narrative was shared by a friend who owns a security company. The witness is one of his employees who began working for him after several years of service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, he stated that he worked for the U.S. Army Criminal Investigations Division before and during those conflicts. He left the service for unspecified reasons. Although this account is secondhand, I believe in the witness's sincerity, though he wishes to remain anonymous. So the report was written by the witness. Now he states, I served as an investigator with CID from 2004 to 2009, working in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most of my assignments involved investigating schemes, including bribery, money laundering, and theft committed by enlisted personnel. Now, in 2005, I was informed that I would be embedded with an Army infantry unit in a mountainous region of the Sulaymaniyah Governorate, which is located in the Iraqi Kurdistan, northeast Iraq. Now, upon reaching my assigned location, we were briefed on unusual activity reported in a specific area just a few miles from the Iranian border. Now, our investigation began with reports from local villagers of Kurdish military, the Peshmerga, who stated that people were being hunted in the mountains by an unknown creature. One man told me that the locals referred to it as a ghoul. Although he had never seen it, he described it as a tall, man-like creature with long arms and legs that fed on human flesh. Now, after gathering this information, I reported my findings to my superiors upon returning to the unit's headquarters. Now, a few days later, I was ordered to return to the area of the strange activity to investigate further, accompanied by an infantry squad leader. The prevailing theory was that it could be a soldier who had gone AWOL, possibly because becoming unhinged and causing issues. Armed conflict can bring out the worst in people, and if this were the case, our job would be formidable. So after several days of surveillance and searches, we had no clue about what we were dealing with. If this was indeed a soldier or a civilian man, we would have seen him or found some evidence. I was beginning to think that this was a wild goose chase, but the villagers were adamant that something was hunting them. So one evening, as the squad leader and I were reviewing a report, we were startled by a horrific scream coming from the direction of a mountain pass that we had searched just a few hours earlier. A few locals who were outside quickly hurried home, clearly frightened, as it was evident that they had heard this scream before. Now, within an hour, the squad and I cautiously entered the pass. Now, although it was night, the moon was bright, allowing us to see clearly. We searched the entire area for several hours with night vision and high-intensity lights, but found nothing. Not a footprint or any evidence of a creature matching the description we had been given. Now, I have always wondered what we heard that night. I have asked several knowledgeable individuals for their opinion, but received little satisfaction. Now, there were many strange occurrences in Iraq that were never publicly disclosed. I have heard about some, but I am certain that many were simply filed away. Now, this is an interesting story because there have been humanoid claims by Persians for almost 900 years. Now, one Persian tale involving Amin and the Ghoul references the valiant angel of death and other folklore. I hope that some of the strange phenomena experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan are revealed at some point, but we'll just have to wait and see. Now, from the mountains of Iraq, we move to the American West, where the name changes, but the pattern remains the same. Here again, we find the same elements: an isolation, a distorted scream, a pale humanoid form, and the unsettling impression that the witness was not merely observing the thing, but being observed in return. Now, this case is important because it shows how the ghoul pattern may survive outside the original cultural vocabulary. Now, no one in Montana called this being a ghoul, yet the emotional texture and physical description echo the same archetype of the pale watcher in the wild. Now, a Montana resident begins to hear terrifying screams coming from the mountains surrounding their home. Eventually, they observe a strange, pale humanoid figure with large black eyes. So the witness tells me, I lived in Montana on some land my dad owns, and I was hiking up a mountain, the Bighorn Mountain Range, like I did most days. While hiking, I heard an unusual screaming noise coming from the other side of the mountain, deeper into the woods and away from my house. It didn't sound like a mountain lion. It was too deep and prolonged, lasting about 10 seconds. I was pretty sure it wasn't a bear either. It sounded like a human voice, but distorted, like something you might hear in a horror movie. Now, when I reached the top of the mountain, I pulled out my binoculars to look in the general direction of the scream. There, I saw a bizarre humanoid figure. It was pale as paper. It had no hair or clothes or any visible genitals, and its arms were longer than its body. Its huge black eyes dominated its face. It was walking, but as soon as I spotted it, it stopped and stared right at me. Now, I watched it carefully for at least 2 minutes, thinking it's staring straight in my soul. Eventually, I had to look away because my eyes began to water from not blinking. Now, when I looked back after wiping my eyes, the creature was gone. I couldn't see it anywhere, which made me question whether I had just hallucinated the whole thing. Regardless of whether it was real or not, I decided to leave the area and ran back home. Now, the scariest part is that 5 minutes after walking in the door, I heard the scream again. It was much closer and it made my ears ring. Now that I think about it, I remember my dad calling me whenever he needed help on my hikes. I'm pretty sure the screams were coming from the area where I first encountered that creature. My dad heard it too, so it wasn't just an hallucination, and my neighbor even mentioned the screams a week after the incident. Now, I've researched it as best I could, but I haven't found anything that matches its exact description. Now, I've never seen it again since that day, and neither has my dad. It's one of the many reasons I decided to move in with my mom in Arizona. Now, not every ghoul is supernatural. Sometimes the most disturbing figure in the record is entirely human. Gettysburg gives us a documented example of that darker truth, a scavenger moving among the dead after one of America's bloodiest battles. Now, this account matters because it anchors the ghoul concept in both history and folklore. The grave violator, corpse thief, and battlefield scavenger may not be a spectral being, but he still embodies the same moral horror that gave rise to the ghoul legends in the first place. Now, in the days following the three-day clash between Union and Confederate forces, Gettysburg was transformed into a vast open-air morgue. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Bodies lay unburied across fields, hillsides, and farmsteads. The stench of death lingered for weeks. Amid this devastation, local citizens and returning soldiers began reporting nocturnal activity on the battlefield. One man was said to move among the corpses under the cover of darkness. He stole boots from the fallen. He stripped clothing and blankets. He searched pockets for money, personal effects, and anything of value. Such men were known at the time as battlefield vultures. In some accounts, the term a godfor appears, a regional slang describing someone morally bankrupt and predatory in the face of tragedy. Now, this individual was eventually apprehended. Contemporary accounts suggest he was beaten or roughly handled upon capture, and some historians have speculated that the damage visible to his nose in a surviving photograph may reflect that confrontation. Now, post-battle scavenging was not uncommon in 19th century warfare. Armies did not have rapid burial systems in place, and civilians often faced extreme poverty. The pattern is practical rather than supernatural. The ghoul represents opportunistic predation in the wake of a catastrophe. Now, public reaction appears to have been a mixture of outrage and fascination. Outrage at the desecration of the dead, and fascination with the physical embodiment of moral decay amid national trauma. Now, similar reports of resurrectionists and battlefield scavengers appeared after the battles of Antietam, Shiloh, and Fredericksburg. Grave robbing and corpse stripping were grim realities in Civil War America. Gettysburg's scale magnified the phenomenon. Now, the Gettysburg Ghoul stands as a stark reminder that the most disturbing monsters in the historical record are often human. Now, it is important to distinguish this feature from later supernatural links associated with Gettysburg, including spectral soldiers, phantom gunfire, and the unrelated Glatfelder Ghoul folklore from Gettysburg College. A battlefield vulture was flesh and blood. Now, the Gettysburg Ghoul is not a tale of apparitions or shadow figures. It's a documented case of human opportunism at its most unsettling. In the broader study of Fortean phenomena and battlefield lore, separating myth from verifiable history is essential. This figure, preserved in a rare 19th century photograph, anchors Gettysburg's supernatural reputation to the darker, more tangible reality. Understanding these human elements allows investigators to approach reported hauntings and legends with clear historical context and disciplined analysis. But before we continue, if you're enjoying tonight's presentation and want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Phantoms and Monsters Radio. It really helps us to reach more people who are searching for answers about the unexplained. And make sure to click the notification button so you won't miss any of our live shows. Now we move from history back into direct witness testimony. In Rockford, Illinois, a teenager standing behind a veterinary clinic catches sight of a pale, emaciated bipedal thing rushing through the tall grass toward a discarded piece of food. Now, what makes this encounter so unnerving is its almost scavenger-like behavior. The witness did not see a predator charging a person, but something opportunistic, quick, hairless, strangely human in structure, and deeply wrong in its movements, as though a graveyard feeder had strayed into a modern landscape. Now, this occurred about 5 years ago when I was 15, according to the witness. My mother is a veterinarian, and we have a clinic on the edge of Rockford, Illinois. It's a large town, roughly 150,000 people, but when I say the edge of town, I mean cornfields of over 30 miles to the west and about 5 miles to the north, but some intermittent forestry in that area. I went with my mother to check on a dog that had spent the night recovering from extensive treatment. There was also a small pug weighing about 9 to 15 pounds staying overnight, so I offered to take the dog outside to do his business, hoping to save my mom one more chore. Now, the back of the clinic faces a grass-covered pond. It's dried up from time to time, but the grass was about 3 to 4 foot tall. I don't remember if it was late winter, early spring, or even early fall, but since there was no snow and the grass was tall, I would guess it was early fall. Now, the front of the clinic is next to a road and other commercial buildings, but as I mentioned, the back is quite undeveloped. There were some leftover cookies in the clinic, so being a kid, I grabbed one and munched on it while I waited for the pug to finish. I'm not super fond of sweets, so I only got halfway through the cookie before deciding I had had enough, and the night had a vaguely eerie feeling. And while there were floodlights on the back of the clinic, the lighting wasn't great. I didn't see anything unusual, so I brushed off the creepy feeling that was just another common Midwestern night. If you're from the Midwest, I'm sure you understand it was quieter than usual. Typically, the pond is filled with the sounds of frogs and insects, but given that it wasn't summer or spring, I dismissed the lack of noise. I lost interest in my cookie and decided to throw it into the grass for small critters to enjoy. I tossed the half cookie about 15 yards away. I don't have a great arm, and it wasn't for a throw. It landed in a thicket of tall grass towards the east. Now, as soon as the cookie landed, I heard and saw something the size of a deer or a person dart off towards it. Now, I'm well versed in local wildlife, and I know how deer move. However, this creature moved like a person, except it was pale as paper and hairless. I could see its spine pushing through its skin, and it didn't have the arch that you'd expect from a quadrupedal animal. Instead, it had a hunched posture like an ape or human, running awkwardly on two legs. All I saw was about 2 feet of its shiny, semi-reflective back, stopping where its neck or shoulders would have started. It had no large shoulder blades like a deer or a dog, but rather a narrow chest like a sighthound or a deer. Yet it was clearly bipedal with ball and socket shoulders. Additionally, deer skittish and wouldn't run towards something thrown in the grass. Now, the instant the cookie landed, both the pug and I froze. I had never been paralyzed by fear before, but in that moment I was. We just watched as this creature ran from one end of the grass to the cookie, where it disappeared. I heard it moving away after it got or investigated the cookie. Once I couldn't hear it anymore, I immediately decided to go back inside. The pug, however, was fixed and needed only a small tug on the leash to follow me, which was unusual. If you know small dogs, they can be obnoxious and overly brave, often barking at everything they don't recognize. But this little dog did make a sound, and as soon as it realized I wanted to leave, it was fully on board. Now, I'm not one for the paranormal or religion, but this was something I could never explain. I know deer, and this thing was not an albino hairless deer. It was something else entirely, with its emaciated body and pale white skin. I can still remember that night in perfect detail, and it still raises the hair on my neck. Now, we have received several reports of humanoid crawler sightings and other human-like beings in the Chicago region since we began investigating the Chicago Mothman phenomena. And the Rockford area has had winged humanoid sightings, and in fact, it was one of the busiest regions outside of Chicago itself. Now, I'm going to tell you, this next one's a little strange. I may have mentioned this years ago, but I think in the context, it needs to be talked about again. Now, this next case brings us directly back into the Middle Eastern tradition. This is not a confirmed modern case file, but a living Kuwaiti legend, one built around deception, liminal space, and the gradual revelation that guests at a wedding were not human at all. Of all the accounts in tonight's presentation, this one may mirror the older Ghoul and Jinn traditions most closely. False hospitality, animal extremities, a vanished setting, and a carefully staged lure all point to the ancient belief that some beings can conventionally imitate human life to draw unsuspecting across a dangerous threshold. Now, for years in Kuwait, people have whispered about a strange wedding performance that turned into a night of terror. The story is usually set in the 1990s or early 2000s and sometimes linked to a famous singer, Nora, though that claim has never been firmly verified. What has kept the tale alive is not merely the fear it inspires, but also the way it echoes older Arab beliefs about jinn, ghouls, shape-shifting beings, and the dangerous unseen world that can imitate human life for its own purposes. Now, this account should be treated as a folklore-level narrative drawn from the main circulating versions, not as a confirmed case file. Take it as you will. Now, in the story, a respected female wedding singer in Kuwait was contacted to perform at an upscale residence on the city's edge. In some tellings, The request came during Ramadan, which only deepened her unease since the hour was late and the insistence unusual. She initially refused. The caller pressed her. The fee offered was far beyond what would normally be paid, so high that it overcame her instincts to stay away. Either a driver arrived collector or she traveled with accompanying musicians, as that seemed to be a large villa lit for celebration. The house looked real enough. The lights were warm, music drifted through the entrance, the tables were filled with food. Guests in elegant dress moved through the hall as if attending wealthy family wedding. Now, at first glance, there was nothing outwardly monstrous, yet the unease did not lift. Now, the women who greeted the musicians were said to feel unnaturally hot to the touch, as if heat radiated through their skin. Others seemed almost right, but not fully. Their faces were composed and human, yet there was something in the eyes, in the smile, in the way they stood too still before suddenly moving too quickly that disturbed the performers. The sense was not that these were people behaving strangely. It was that something non-human was imitating people and not doing it perfectly. Now, as the night went on, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The celebration became less like a wedding and more like a display. The dancing intensified. Movements became harsher and faster and increasingly unnatural, as though the guests were no longer maintaining the restraint of ordinary human imitation. The musicians noticed details that sharpened their fear. When garments shifted and hems lifted during the dancing, several witnesses claimed to see legs that did not belong to any human being. In some versions, the limbs resembled those of a horse. In others, they looked like sheep or goat legs, ending in hoof-like feet. Some tellings had coarse hair, thickened skin, and hands that looked more like claws or animal appendages than human fingers. It was then the performers realized that they were not among ordinary wedding guests. Now, in older Arab traditions, the ghoul does not always appear as a monster from the onset. It comes clothed in deception, borrowing beauty, status, or familiarity only along its true nature to emerge in fragments. This is how this night began to feel. The elegance of the celebration no longer suggested wealth. It suggested bait. Some accounts say the bride and groom then appeared seated upon a strange ceremonial structure, almost like a throne with a gaping bestial mouth. Others simply say the room fell into a terrible silence before the final break. The lights suddenly went out, and in that instant, the singers and musicians fled. Now, from there, the story divides into two endings. In one version, the lead singer made it to the waiting car. Shaking, nearly unable to speak, she told the driver that the women inside had animal legs. He turned towards her and answered with a chilling calm, asking if she meant legs like this. Then he revealed his own non-human legs. She hurled herself from the moving vehicle and was later found unconscious in the street. In another version, the women ran out of the villa in panic and were stopped by a passerby or taxi driver who demanded to know why they had come running from an abandoned property in the middle of the night. When they turned back to look, the grand mansion was no longer a place of music, light, and celebration. It was derelict, empty, ruined, and in some tellings simply gone from sight altogether, as though the structure they had entered had only been a glamour laid over a desolate place. By morning, nothing at the site matched what the witnesses believed they had seen hours earlier. In some accounts, the authorities returned with them and found no evidence of a wedding venue. In others, only abandoned buildings remained. After that, the story passes into rumor. The singer withdrew from public life. The musicians would not speak of what happened. No final explanation was ever given. What gives the Kuwait story its lasting power is how closely it resembles older Middle Eastern supernatural patterns. The invitation comes at night. The destination is liminal, set apart, and reached through trust in a stranger. Hospitality conceals a threat. Beauty hides corruption. The beings appear human but reveal animal extremities. The very sort of imperfect disguise long associated with ghouls and other deceptive entities in Arab lore. The place itself refuses stability, appearing one way in darkness and another in daylight. The entire experience reads less like a haunting and more like an orchestrated lure. Viewed through that lens, the legend is not simply about jinn in the broadest sense. It becomes something more specific and more disturbing, a modern Gulf retelling of an older belief that certain beings can create false human scenes, draw travelers or guests into them, and reveal their true nature only when escape has become difficult. Now, in that sense, the Kuwait wedding legend stands very close to the Ghoul tradition, where the danger is not only the creature itself, but its ability to mimic the human world convincingly enough to draw unsuspecting across a threshold they do not understand. Now, the cemetery has always been one of the ghouls' nature domains, so this next account deserves close attention. Two teenagers walking through a cemetery in Rossville, Illinois, encountered a pale, hairless humanoid moving on all fours behind the headstones, then circling them just out of sight. This report adds another layer to the particularly interesting the aftermath. The nightmares, the bad luck, and the lingering psychological pressure suggest that in some cases the encounters may not end when the witness leaves the location, which is very much in keeping with the older traditions surrounding polluted places and the spiritually dangerous contact. So the witness tells me, back when I was in high school, my friend and I encountered something I've started referring to as a crawler. Now, this happened in Rossville, Illinois at night in the cemetery. I believe it was late summer or early fall, as I don't recall it being too cold. It was around 2010, and I'm pretty sure the moon was full or nearly so because visibility was quite good. My friend and I used to walk a loop. We would leave our house and go down a block to a side road that led to a park. From there, they would turn left and cut across the park to the cemetery's side entrance. The cemetery and park were located on the southwest corner of town, beyond where they were just woods and cornfields. If you walked straight through the cemetery, it would take us to another side road that led back to the main street, returning us to her house. So one night, we made it to the cemetery and began walking along the main drive that split the property in half. Suddenly, we heard a voice or noise that made us both stop. My friend started laughing nervously and asked if I had heard it too. And I told her I'd seen what made the noise. To our left, I spotted something running behind the headstone. It was on all fours, but appeared humanoid. It had extremely pale skin, no hair, and looked very thin. I remember it was so pale that it almost reflected moonlight. It moved rapidly, too fast for any human I've ever seen on their hands and feet. So I couldn't see many details. It was in profile, so I never saw its facial features. The way it ran was animal-like, with its feet coming forward almost between its hands or past them. It resembled the gait of a big cat or wild dog running. Both of us were terrified. We just stood there panicking and listening to it move around, just out of sight, while we called one of her friends to come and get us. When her friend, a typical high school boy, arrived, he wanted to stay in the cemetery and goof off. Strangely, having him there made it feel less scary, But I remember the creature continuing to circle us. It always stayed out of sight, but we could hear it moving. Occasionally, it would come closer, then dart further away again. Eventually, we left. I spent some time researching it and even reached out to a paranormal group in Champaign for advice. The person I spoke with never heard of it, but wanted to document what we saw. We met with him for an interview, but the group never conducted an investigation. Now, fast forward a few years, and I found myself living in Aurora, Colorado. In 2012, I met up with my closest friends. We really clicked because we both had an interest in the paranormal. And when I eventually told him about what I had seen, he was shocked. His jaw dropped. He shared that he had seen something similar. He described exactly what he had seen, but said he encountered it under a porch while living in Thornton. It was crouched, hunched over something it was holding, and he believed he startled it while it was eating. Now, coming from a Navajo Apache background, his initial guess was it could have been a skinwalker or maybe a Wendigo. However, he later expressed doubts about that explanation. He was dating a girl at the time whose mother claimed to be a medium. She suggested it was something someone had woken up and was now angry, but we both doubted that explanation. The stranger part came when we began discussing our experiences. We both started having very intense nightmares about it. His were worse than mine and lasted much longer. Now, this period was also marked by 6 months of bad luck and anxiety for both of us. Initially, I brushed it off as us psyching ourselves out until I submitted my story to a podcast. After my story was read, another listener sent in their own account describing exactly what my friend and I had seen. Their experiences were also accompanied by nightmares, and we couldn't dismiss them because they spoke about their nightmares in detail, which matched my friend's nightmares exactly. I have never revealed the actual content of either of our nightmares. Now, I've read numerous stories online and sifted through extensive lore and cryptid lists. Despite all the research, I still feel like I haven't found a concrete answer to what this thing is. My best guess is that nightmares aren't coincidental and that they are interdimensional. It seems capable of interacting with physical things around it, but I've never heard of anyone reporting a physical attack or even being touched. After hours of speculation, I've concluded that there's no definitive answer. It doesn't fit neatly into any specific cryptid category. I suspect it might be something that has been around for a long time and has inspired other cryptids of paranormal tales. However, I don't believe it's a Wendigo, skinwalker, ghoul, or anything like that. So we have another one from Illinois. Excuse me a second. Now, our next account is one of the clearest examples of a witness later finding a folkloric label that seems to fit what they saw. Near a cave-lined cemetery outside Effingham, Illinois, 3 friends encountered a crouched, hairless, gray humanoid with glowing yellow eyes and extremely long arms. What makes this report stand out is not only the appearance of this being, but the location. Caves, cemeteries, and remote roads are all classic liminal environments. And when the witness later discovered ghoul lore describing cave dwellers, the corpse feeders are near burial grounds, and the parallels become impossible to ignore. So the witness tells me, in 2010, 2 friends and I were driving through the countryside near Effingham, Illinois, about 30 minutes from our home. It was a typical weekend night, and we were headed to a cemetery, the Casbar Cemetery, deep in the woods and surrounded by caves, which we had heard was a great place to explore respectively. We stopped for sodas at a gas station in Effingham before heading into the country. It was around 1 or 2 a.m. and it was dark outside. As we drove, I noticed something with yellow glowing eyes off on the side of the road. just past the ditch illuminated by our headlights. It was too short to be a deer, but too big to be a possum or raccoon. And as we got closer, I could see it more clearly, a skinny, hairless, gray, human-like figure that was definitely not human. It looked bizarre. Crouched down, its arms were incredibly long and estimated that it could have been 7 foot tall or taller if it stood up. A chill ran down my spine, my heart raced, and my hair stood on end. I whispered to myself, "What the hell?" At that moment, I heard my friend in the back seat shout, "What the hell is that?" Complete shock and terror washed over me, and I couldn't make a sound. I was just staring at it. By the time we were right in front of it, we passed it, and it simply watched us as we drove by before slinking back into the darkness. We all started screaming, completely freaking out. I was convinced it was a demon for months, but still doubted myself, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. That night, we didn't even make it to the Casbah cemetery. We went straight home and couldn't sleep. So now, 6 months later, while at a different friend's house, she received a text from her cousin with a picture from the trail camera. I felt another chill run down my spine as the hair on the back of my neck stood tall again. I was seeing that creature again. I realized we weren't crazy. There was something to this. Her cousin claimed that he caught her on a trail cam one town over. Later, he admitted it wasn't his camera and that it was just pranking us. But I immediately recognized the image and asked her to send it to me. I then forwarded it to my friend who had been with me that night, and he quickly replied, "That's that effing thing we saw." Although I found out the picture was fake, I still couldn't shake my doubts and continued researching the image and demons to find answers, but found nothing. Now, in 2014, while scrolling through my Facebook news feed, the trail camera picture popped up again. One girl I knew posted it on another friend's wall. It immediately shared my story in the comments. And as I scrolled through the previous comments, I saw that another girl had also mentioned seeing a similar creature. She replied to my comment, telling me that she had encountered it in the countryside of Effingham, too, back in 2011. A guy we went to school with also commented, mentioning that he and a friend who was into the occult, his friend said these creatures are called ghouls. This sent me on a deep dive into researching ghouls. What I found blew my mind. The lore stated that ghouls are cave dwellers. As I mentioned before, the Casbah cemetery is surrounded by caves. They are said to feed on recently dead and typically remains near cemeteries and to live there to be near a food source. Ghouls are known to reveal themselves to humans when fresh, recently deceased bodies are scarce and may attempt to get close to humans for nourishment. Now, the images I found were illustrations, but they looked exactly like what I had seen that night. Everything I read aligned perfectly with my experience, leaving me unable to explain it away. Now, to understand why these modern accounts resonate so strongly, we need to return to the older literature. Now, this final segment takes us into the 19th century commentary and an older Baghdad tale that reveals how deeply the Ghoul tradition was tied to corpse feeding, cemeteries, hidden identities, and nocturnal predation. Now, this account is especially valuable because it shows that the Ghoul was not always imagined as the beast of the wasteland. Sometimes it entered the home, the marriage bed, and the family itself, appearing human until its appetite exposed what it truly was. Now, the witness states, "I've never been overly drawn to modern horror fiction for its own sake, but folklore, historical belief, and the older record of how people once understood the supernatural have always held my attention. Some time ago, while reading the Book of Werewolves, Werewolf History and Folklore by Sabin Baring Gould, I came across a passage that stood out to me, not simply because of its grotesque imagery, but because of how closely it echoes the older ghoul traditions of the Middle East. Now, the book was published in 1865. More than 3 decades later, more than 3 decades before Bram Stoker's Dracula would help shape the modern vampire myth in the popular imagination. Yet, even then, Baring Gould was pointing to something older and darker, a body of belief centered not on the elegant, aristocratic vampire, but on grave violators, corpse feeders, and nocturnal beings that moved among tombs under the cover of darkness. Now, in this discussion, he refers to the longstanding Eastern idea that certain individuals or entities wander cemeteries by moonlight, clawing in the graves with unnatural determination, driven by the craving for the flesh of the dead. Now, what struck me was how directly this imagery aligns with the traditional Arabic ghoul. In Middle Eastern lore, the ghoul is not merely a monster in abstract. It is a being of desolation, burial grounds, lonely places, and the boundaries between human and the unclean. It is often associated with deception, with feeding on corpses, with the violent hunger that places it outside the ordinary order of nature. Baring Gould's description, whether filtered through the 19th century scholarship or Victorian assumptions, still preserves that older core. These are not just witches, body snatchers, or vague horrors. They resemble the graveyard predators of Arab legend, things that dig deep into the resting places of the dead and the profane that should remain untouched until dawn drives them away. He goes on to suggest that such stories may not have arisen entirely from fantasy, and in some cases he believed the tales may have grown out of the real acts of grave robbery, corpse mutilation, and occult practices involving human remains. Now, that possibility is worth noting because it reflects a pattern seen throughout folklore. Supernatural traditions often form around actual transgressions. The grave robber becomes more than a criminal. The corpse violator becomes something inhuman. Over time, the act and the legend fuse, and what remains is the image of a ghoul, half human, half something far worse, lurking among the tombs, feeding on the dead. Now, Baring Gould even notes that in parts of Europe, especially Brittany, churchyards were once illuminated at night to discourage those thought to desecrate graves under darkness. That detail is fascinating because it shows that the fear of the graveyard predator was not confined in the Arab world, though it took one of its most vivid forms there. The imagery may have traveled, evolved, or merged with local traditions, but the underlying terror remains the same. Something comes in the night for the dead and perhaps for the living as well. Now, after this passage, Baring Gould recounts an older tale set in Baghdad, one that is especially revealing because it bridges two related but distinct traditions, the corpse-eating ghoul and the blood-drinking revenant. Now, in the story, an elderly merchant of Baghdad had become wealthy through trade and had only one son, Abu Hassan, whom he loved deeply. Wishing to secure his future, he arranged a marriage for him with the daughter of another prosperous merchant, a woman of means but little beauty. The son resisted and instead fell in love with Nadia, the daughter of a wise man. After much pressure, the father finally yielded, and the marriage to Nadia went forward with all the pomp and ceremony that one would expect. At first, all seemed well, but soon Abu Hassan noticed something deeply unsettling. Each night, once he believed him asleep, his bride quickly rose from the bed and disappeared, returning only shortly after dawn. Suspicion overcame him, and one night he pretended to sleep and followed her. She made her way to the cemetery. There, under the scattered moonlight, he watched her enter a tomb. When he crept after her, he discovered a scene of absolute horror. Gathered within were ghouls feasting on the flesh of the dead, feeding on corpses torn from their graves. His own wife was among them, taking part in the grotesque banquet with enthusiasm. The woman he had married by day belonged by night to the company of graveyard predators. This is where the story becomes especially important. In traditional ghoul lore, the creature is not monstrous at first glance, and it may wear human form. It may move among people unnoticed, and it may even enter the home, bed, or family itself. Its true nature is revealed only when it crosses into its proper domain, the tomb, the wasteland, the place of death. Nadia fits that pattern perfectly. She's not merely a vampire in the later European sense. She is something older, more primal, a hidden devourer of the dead whose human appearance conceals an unclean appetite. Now, Abu Hassan managed to escape without being seen and returned to his bed, keeping silent until the following evening. Now, when supper was laid and his wife again refused to eat, he confronted her in anger, declaring that she preferred to keep her appetite for the ghouls' feast. At that, she turned pale, trembled, and withdrew without a word. That silence is telling. There is no denial, no outrage, no attempt to explain herself. The accusation had named her true nature. At midnight, she returned, no longer as a hidden cemetery feeder, but an outright predator. She threw herself upon her husband with nails and teeth, tore his throat, and opened a vein to drink his blood. In this moment, the tale shifts. The ghoul of the grave becomes something closer to a revenant, crossing fully into the blood-drinking rule that later audiences recognized as vampiric. Abu Hassan fought back and killed her, and she was buried the following day. But the matter did not end there. 3 nights later, she returned from the grave and attacked him again. Only then did Abdul Hassan take the final step. He opened her tomb, burned her remains to ashes, and cast them into the Tigris, destroying the body so that it could not rise again. Now, taken as a whole, the account is fascinating because it preserves the overlap between different supernatural archetypes before modern horror fiction hardened them into separate categories. Here, the female figure is at once wife, ghoul, corpse eater, revenant, and blood drinker. She belongs in the cemetery, the night, the violated grave. She returns after the burial. She attacks the living. She must be destroyed by fire and dispersal. And in that sense, the story sits at the crossroads of Arab ghoul belief and the later vampire tradition. What interests me most is not whether the tale is literally true. It's what the story reveals about how such beings are imagined. Now, in Middle Eastern tradition, the ghoul is not always just a wandering desert monster. It could be intimate, hidden, and domestic. It could enter human life through marriage, affection, and trust. It could pass as one of us until its appetite exposes it. That is far more disturbing idea than a simple graveyard beast. So when Baring Gould included this story in 1965, he was doing more than recounting an exotic curiosity. He was preserving an older supernatural pattern, one rooted in the fear that death does not remain sealed, that some beings are drawn to the corpse, and that the boundary between human and the inhuman may be thinner than what we'd like to believe. Long before the polished vampire entered popular fiction, there was the ghoul at the tomb, the hidden feeder among the dead, and a beautiful wife who slipped from the marriage bed into the graveyard night. So when we look across these reports, a pattern emerges that is older than any one culture and more persistent than many people realize. The ghoul is not just the folkloric monster of the Arab world. It is a larger predatory template, one that appears wherever the living and the dead and the human and the inhuman, the familiar and the forbidden begin to overlap. It appears in mountains and cemeteries, on rural roads and battlefields, in abandoned places and deceptive hospitality, and in the pale humanoid form that witnesses still describe today. Now, whether these beings are literal entities, symbolic projections, mislabeled phenomena, or manifestations of an ultraterrestrial reality, the continuity is striking. The old traditions warn of corpse feeders, mimic beings, and predators that move just beyond the edge of the accepted reality. Modern witnesses, often with no knowledge of these traditions at all, continue to describe creatures and situations that fall into the same pattern. That does not prove every account, but it does suggest that the ghoul as an idea, and perhaps as a phenomena, has never been entirely confined to the past. Now, if you have experienced anything like this or had an unexplained encounter or sighting, you can send your report to Phantoms and Monsters. And as always, thank you for listening. So, folks, if you got questions, just put them up there and I'll try to answer them for you. Dynamic. Could ghouls or skinwalkers be in the same category? Well, again, a skinwalker is a living human that has transformed. Is it? I mean, do skinwalkers eat flesh? I mean, dead flesh. I think in some instances it has been proven that when these witches or people who turn into skinwalkers or maybe even wendigos do fall into that category at some point. It's hard to tell. It kind of does run into each other. I mean, they do kind of overlap each other. So, yeah, I guess it's entirely possible. Paranormalism Net. Have you had any reports of cryptid shapeshifting? Occasionally, something will come in that seems to suggest there's a shapeshifting ability. Even with the winged humanoids, there seems to be some type of shapeshifting involved there, especially when they're moving out and manifest from either a portal or a liminal space. People have described it. Now, occasionally we will get a report where people will describe something either changing shapes or changing manner and such. But it's rare. It doesn't happen a lot. Jose Sanchez, might ghoul be another name for a low crawler? I guess it could be. We don't know much about these so-called crawlers. Is there actually a tie-in? It could be. That's why I threw a couple of the more creepy ones, crawler humanoids, into this presentation, because it does seem to suggest there may be a connection. Though I'm not saying there is, but give you a little bit to think about anyway. Lala, what was the last time you either experienced one or some type of proof of someone that's a skinwalker or shapeshifter experience? And what was it? Well, of course, we've had a lot of accounts come out of the Navajo reservation area and people of First Nations. They swear by these accounts. Now, again, many of the accounts that come out are coming from the younger folks because the older folks will not talk about it. Now, if there's a lesson to be learned, and one of the older people needs to talk about a skinwalker to prove a point in a story or something that they did that they shouldn't have done, then something will come out. But it's very rare. And I've always wondered if some of the skinwalker accounts that I have received have been embellished upon by the younger folks. So I don't know. But traditionally, the skinwalker is a Navajo witch who has the ability to possibly shapeshift or move their body in a form that seems to be possessed. And in some cases, they are said to feed upon the dead. But I don't know if I've ever had an occasion or had an account that actually demonstrated that. Allie Staring, do you have any objects that are possessed or cursed? Do I? Yeah, I do. And that's all I'll say. But I do. There's some people in this in this chat who do know I have certain things that are supposed to be possessed or that I feel are possessed. But I don't try to keep too many of them. And if I do keep it, it's for a good reason. I don't use it in any type of work that I do. It's just a curiosity for the most part, or it's maybe a crystal or something that holds a lot of value to me. But it's kept well far away from everybody. Anything else, folks? Okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming in. And all I can tell you is just stay safe, stay aware, and as always, keep looking into the unexplained. I don't know if you enjoyed this type of presentation tonight, but it was something different. So I hope you got something out of it. So anyway, have a nice evening. Have a great weekend and see you next week. Good night.